Hello and welcome. And how should leaders deal with loss? Yes, we as leaders have to face loss throughout, almost constantly, whether it be with losing a client, losing a project, losing team members, losing funding, losing face in the marketplace, losing. It almost feels like as leaders we are constantly faced with having to deal with loss. Well, how do we best deal with loss? Well, as we do every week, we have a look at things that are happening in the news and try to take from that as a metaphor for us to learn from, as to become better leaders ourselves. And so we're going to be talking about a few things. We're going to be talking about Giannis from Milwaukee Bucks and how he responds to loss. We're going to be talking about the French and how they seem to be dealing with loss at the moment. Talking about SpaceX. Talking about a lost chapter of the Bible, and also looking at the Bible and how that is how God actually talks to us and guides us to be how to respond to loss as leaders. But before we get into that, I want to share something a little bit. I want to share something, and I want to share something about purpose. And this is, I have actually not prepped. Dr. Rod, by the way, welcome once again, Dr. Rod, St. Hill, the business pastor. How are you doing this week?
I'm doing pretty well, actually. I'm in a different country for a change.
You'll notice that Dr. Rod has a different background today, and it's because he is visiting his daughter and son-in-law in Seattle. So yes, flew all the way from the Gold Coast in Australia, and he's now in America. And it feels like, Dr. Rod, you are within touching distance now. I could almost touch you, but it's such a pity that you're still so far away. But at least we're on somewhat the same time zone now.
That's
Somewhat.
right, we are. Not that much of a difference.
Only a couple of hours behind. Now, like I said, there's something I wanted to share. There's something I wanted to get off my heart, and I didn't actually prep Dr. Rod with this because I kind of wanted this to be a surprise, because I want to talk authentically about this, and I actually want him to go into his normal advice mode like he does when he and I talk on the phone. And I just want to pour out. I want to talk about purpose. Purpose is very, very important to me, well, to everyone. Look, let's be honest, everyone's purpose should be important to them. But it's a core part of how I have always operated my life. It's a core part of how we operate our business, a core part of how we operate our leadership program. We spend our first 10 weeks of our free leadership program. Yeah, shameless plug. Check out the link below. Free leadership program. You spend the first 10 weeks focusing on you understanding your purpose as a leader. And then everything else is really how you help others discover their purpose as leaders. And you'll notice a lot of our conversations tend to lead back or turn back to purpose and our purpose as a leader, because I believe that that's kind of the core of what causes poor leadership. Now, remember, I say poor leadership, I'm not talking about poor leaders, because there's some great leaders out there that are displaying poor leadership. And so it's really important that we separate the two. Now, we need to understand what our purpose is. And one thing that I have been personally battling with over the last, well, I mean, we've been doing this podcast now for, what we're in our 23rd week now. So we've been doing it for 6 months. I've been trying to battle, are we representing the right thing? And one thing that's really been coming to mind lately is I obviously see a lot of people in YouTube and a lot of influencers that their channels are dedicated to really ripping apart bad theology, bad church leaders, and all that sort of stuff. And I must admit, I got caught up in it a little bit in the last couple of weeks, and I thought maybe it is our job, because I mean, a mission that I believe that God gave me was to eradicate poor leadership. And like I said, it's the behavior, not the person. And so I'm thinking, maybe we meant to be going a little bit harder at the poor leaders, or at the poor leadership that we're talking about, and maybe go directly to the people, because what we tend to do is we tend to try to separate the behavior from the person, because I believe that's what we're called to do, but also just look at that event as a metaphor of how we can be better leaders ourselves. And so in doing that, we don't go hard on attacking or trying to correct the person or the actual behavior of that person. We're kind of very separate. And there was a comment that was put on one of our videos. Now, unfortunately, a lot of the comments on our videos tend to be, let's just say, keyboard warriors, people that are just, I don't know whether you've noticed this, and it's really surprised me. There's some negative people on the internet, and some negative people with some strong opinions. And usually when they put comments, all what they're doing is displaying their stupidity, because a lot of their negative comments are actually negated by, if they actually watched our entire video or even watched the entire podcast or whatever, their question would be answered, or their challenge would be answered anyway. But there was one comment recently that kind of stuck with me in a positive way. Now, I've actually kind of avoided really getting into the comments and replying to them, because, as I say, if you argue with a stupid person, it makes two, right? And so I've kind of avoided that, and I've kind of avoided just getting into it myself. And so, hey, look, if you want to leave positive comments, I'd love to see those coming through. Let's flood the comments with positive comments, yes. But there was a comment that I noticed that stuck with me, and I was surprised at my positive response to it. Someone put a comment in there saying, "You guys are spin doctors." And I know that, I assume that they were meaning it in a negative way, that you're spin doctors, because yes, we're always looking at this situation, but we're not actually accusing the person or anything like that. We're trying to figure out how we would react and try to interpret what we would do, and try to take that stance on it. And I suppose in that respect, we are spin doctors. And I would actually say that what was obviously meant to be an insult is kind of what I would see as my purpose, as my gift, as my calling in life, is I've always been able to see a situation and turn it into a metaphor that I can learn and then teach from. Part of my gifting and Dr. Rod's teaching is we're teachers. And so I've always been able to just see everyday events and be able to spin them into a lesson. And so whoever made that comment that we're spin doctors, thank you. Yes, we are spin doctors. We spin a bad situation and try to figure out how we can learn and bring a lesson for us as leaders. Our purpose, our calling, is not to be one of those channels that pulls people down. Let me talk to you for a second, Dr. Rod. What's the go with we as a church? Now, I'm battling, because yes, I believe that we need to call out bad behavior. I agree with that, right? We have to call out bad behavior. But I also believe we need to stand united as a church. How do we do those two things?
What, you're asking me? I thought you were going to tell us. I thought you were going to tell us. Look, well, the Bible actually says we are to prefer one another. We're to submit to one another. So I think part of the unity story is submitting our own opinions to those of others and not trying, as it were, to rule the roost.
Yeah.
And a lot of it, I guess, is personal decisions that we make about how we relate to others. And as far as I'm concerned on this podcast, unless I know what is true, as it were, the facts about a situation, I'm very reluctant to criticise any individual. and would rather focus on lessons for leadership, which is virtually what you said. Look, I do think that sometimes in the church we can be throwing stones at other people without necessarily realizing that we're living in a glass house ourselves. So I'm not that interested in using social media to criticize other people. Certainly, we may be able to criticize ideas, and I hope we do that from time to time. We may even be able to criticize what people have said, but I do think we need to be extremely careful about criticizing individuals. So, for example, we don't want to put labels on people. That's really not our purpose. I don't go through life trying to do that. I just don't see that's the way that God sees us.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of podcasts these days have a strong political flavour, not necessarily party political, but they do have a strong political flavour. And the philosophies of politics these days are generally to be quite aggressively against people rather than ideas. And I just hope there's room on social media for a podcast like ours, where we try to focus on ideas, when we try to focus on what people have said or their actions, with a focus on the action or the words rather than the people, because frankly, all of us ought to be criticised at one time or another, but preferably in private by people who do so because they love us and want to see us grow.
Yeah, like, and I kind of take it of, and obviously, Dr. Roddy, you've known me, and anyone that goes through our free leadership program will know I'm always talking about past leadership experiences that were negative, but I speak about them in a very positive light because I've learned from it, I've grown from it, and so, and I have empathy for those people. I know that they are great leaders. They were just displaying poor leadership, trying to separate the behavior from the person. And also, I mentioned this is like, I don't want to speak negatively about their ministry, about their business, about their calling, because they have great missions. They have great purposes to fulfill themselves. Yes, they may not be doing it in the best way, but who am I to get in the way of something that what God is trying to do, right? He's trying to do it in partnership with failed humans, and we all may make mistakes. And so I suppose I take that same attitude as I would talk about my past experiences, as I do in talking about these, is even with those past experiences, even though I was in the situation, I still don't know the whole story. I don't know what was going in my business partner's mind, or my senior pastor's mind, or in my my client's mind, or my, whoever it was. I don't know what was really going on in their minds and in their lives outside of. I can only assume and try to gather as much information, but we never know. And so, especially from such a distance from these news topics that we're talking about, we don't know. Also, I'm not a news reporter. I don't research, right? So I don't, like, I do a bit of research on this and try to find different articles and try to get as many different views from it as possible. But I'm not a news reporter, so I'm not gathering all of the facts. All what I see is, while I see a news article, if something jumps out at me, I'm like, oh, there's a good lesson in that. That's what I'm doing, and that's all I want from you to be able to gain from this stuff as well. Not necessarily that we're trying to pull these people down, or even trying to celebrate them and put them up on a pedestal or anything like that. It's just like, here's a lesson for us to learn. I learn it. I just want to share it with you. And so, yeah, look, yes, we are spin doctors. We should all be spin doctors, just learning from situations. Let's not be, and going back to purpose. I know it's not my purpose to call out those people and to step, because I'm not, once again, I'm not researched enough. I can't spend enough time research. That's just not me. And I'm not that sort of a person. There are some people that is their purpose, and you see them on YouTube, and that's their calling. Good on them. But I once again, I will admit fault. I got wrapped up into somewhat like I saw a lot of negative reports about Mike Todd and his recent stuff on his Easter stuff, and they're pulling out some of his his things. And I must admit, I got caught up in that. We spoke about how the Transformation Church and Mike Todd's church have taken on Carl Lentz and now like how iffy that is. And I must admit that I personally was starting to have a negative thought process towards Michael Todd. I'd see something and I'd be like, oh yeah, that evil guy, or like, and I'm just like, went, hold on a second. I should not be thinking about that, because I know that there's other pastors that I follow that people are trying to tear them down, and they pull out like one sentence from what that pastor has said and misconstrue it. Yet I've seen or listened to every single sermon that pastor has preached since they started preaching publicly, and I know that that's not their heart. I know that that's not who they are, and so I corrected myself and went, you know what? If I'm going to have this view about Mike Todd, I'm going to go back and I'm going to listen to Mike Todd. I'm going to go and listen to all of his sermons and get a full view of what he preaches and see what he has. And can I tell you, look, I'm no theologian, and are there some things that are might be questionably theologically? Maybe, but I'm no deep theologian. Are his sermons motivational? Yes, they are. They do tend to be on because that's his style. Is he blunt with some of his corrections from the Bible? Yeah. And I think that's what everyone argues about these motivational speakers, is like they're not correcting, that they're not preaching the fire and brimstone stuff that, well, actually he does. Now there's some things that might be questionable, but I will say this. In me listening to Mike Todd, my faith spirit has been ignited again, right? Because he just does these crazy things stepping out in faith. And I had a senior pastor that was like that, and I haven't been around him for a while. And I must admit, I've kind of I realized in listening to him, I'm like, I haven't been stepping out as much in faith. And so whether he's theologically fine or what, like, you know what? My spirit has benefited from it. Now, am I going to take wholeheartedly every single theological thing he says? No. I filter everything through the Holy Spirit. I make sure I study my own Bible. I make sure I listen to many different pastors to make sure I get a broad view. And I have my pastor, Dr. Rod St. Hill, that I speak to and get correction from and make sure that things are sound anyway. So sorry, I have been ranting a little bit. That's something on my heart. But I suppose just to kind of wrap it up, Dr. Rod, how do we, obviously knowing our purpose, right? Our purpose is not to really stand here and pick it against those people, but see how we can learn, and hopefully they watch our stuff and can learn from our stuff at some point. But what about those people that their purpose is to call out that stuff? How would you advise someone that they believe that that's their calling? How would you advise them to do that in a way that doesn't disunite the church?
Well, don't start up a website and use that as your main medium for criticism, all right? And one of the things I noticed quite some time ago was that just about every prominent ministry in the United States, you can find 2 or 3 websites that are effectively dedicated to pulling them down. Mm-hmm. So look, I think generally speaking, when correction comes, it comes through face-to-face interactions with other people. And I think that's the best place to start. It always is. Sometimes people will talk about the Matthew 18 principle, which I think actually applies to someone who has sinned. In fact, it's quite specific about that. And you go and see that person in private, and if you don't resolve the issue, you take a couple of others with you, and then ultimately you bring it up before the whole of the congregation in a church situation. I don't think that necessarily should apply when it's just a difference of opinion. We're not necessarily talking about sin, but in general, it's better if you can to just talk face to face. If it's someone you know and love, and they're confident that you're correcting them not only for their own sake, but for the sake of those whom they influence, then I think that's generally the best way to go. I don't know that there's a lot of value in us using social media to criticise someone we hardly know. I just don't think it has any impact at all. Sometimes, of course, criticism can be very hurtful, especially when it's unjustified. So, generally speaking, I doubt that God calls us to tear down other ministries and denominations via social media. I hate to say that because I think that would cut a lot of people's time short, no doubt.
Yeah.
But I just don't think it's the appropriate way to do it. I never think it's appropriate to do this kind of thing publicly unless it's a very last resort and unless the stakes are also very high. So, we've talked about people like Brian Houston and so on and in the past, and obviously there are so many people attacking them who probably have never actually met them ever in their lives, so they don't know what they're like in face-to-face interactions. And they don't even know what the truth is of the so-called facts that are out there because they usually gather their facts by harvesting them from social media, and social media is notoriously unreliable.
The media are ridiculously unreliable. Yeah. And they can talk about being spin doctors. They can spin it any way that they can. But okay, that's really good advice. So, I had this thought that if you are one of those YouTube channels or feel like you're called to challenge bad theology, then challenge the bad theology, not challenge the person, right? Maybe say, hey, I saw someone preach this, and maybe even pull that person's face and name. Now, here's the thing. I know that part of it is you're getting clicks. You need to use a face for clicks. That's the reason why we use these metaphors. I'll use it straight up because I'm going to talk about Giannis in the Milwaukee Bucks, and hopefully there's some people who are interested in him that'll then find us, that'll then learn some leadership stuff as well. Yes, I get that. I understand that you're going for clicks, but what are you trying to do? Because you're going to have to be answerable to the king as well, right? About how you approach things and how you've shepherded your flock. And so maybe there's a way that you can do it without attacking the person, but bring up, look, there was this, they said, their stuff is generally pretty good, but this statement was a little questionable. And let's look into that and let's exegete that completely, right? Like do that. That's fine. But once again, like I said before, we call poor leadership the behavior, not the person. And so maybe if you're called out, if you believe you're called to speak against bad theology or what poor leadership or anything like that, let's separate the person from the act and look at it individually because we don't know the whole story. Thank you, Dr. Rod, for allowing me to get that off my chest. It was just something that I wanted to talk to you about, get your take on. And the reason why I didn't mention it beforehand is sometimes we'll talk about the topics before the podcast. And then when we get into the podcast, we don't talk about it as organically because we've kind of had the conversation before. And I'm like, I wish we had been recording that bit. So that was really good. So let's get into talking about Giannis Antetokounmpo. I'm sorry, I completely butchered that, but I wanted to at least give it a go. So Giannis, an absolute rock star. He had I'm now trying to remember. I was thinking about in my research. I was going to write this down and I forgot to look it up. But I'll put a link into the video afterwards, but he has a kind of a movie documentary about him and his brother. They're like the only family that have got three, brothers from the family in the NBA. And this goes from their story of like escaping, escaping across Europe, trying to escape persecution and stuff like that. And it's actually quite an interesting story. So watch the video. But Giannis is the star player and the captain of the Milwaukee Bucks, who were last year's NBA champion. And they were knocked out early in this year's championships by the Miami Heat. Now, the Miami Heat are very lowly ranked this year, and they weren't expected to do well. And they kind of did really well against the Bucks, which wasn't expected. And a sports reporter asked the coach and then asked Giannis this same question. And Giannis's response was, I would have to say that this response will go down in history as the greatest ever sports response to a loss, right? If you want to know how a leader should respond to a loss, listen to this response. So the question from the sports reporter was, do you view this season as a failure? Now, I'll link, the links below. All our articles are below. Go and watch the video. His full response is just phenomenal. And on top of it, just as a bit of a side note, he keeps pulling himself up for getting personal as like in the response. I'm like, there is so much wisdom in this man. And like, just for him to go, and wouldn't you, actually, no, that's getting too personal. And then at the end, he goes, sorry for getting personal. Like you can still defend something without getting personal about it, which I think that's a kind of side point. But this was his response. So why you ask me that question? Now it's a direct quote, so his English isn't all that great. So excuse my English while I'm saying this. It's the wrong question. There's no failure in sports. There's good days, bad days. Some days you're able to be successful. Some days you are not. Some days it's your turn. Some days it's not. That's what sports is about. You don't always win. And then later on, he kind of emphasizes that it isn't about the loss. It's not a failure. It's steps to success. That every season, it gives us a lesson, gives us something to learn from so we can build on. We can't always win every season, but there might be a building phase. And I think this is really great as a leader. And even looking at business leaders and ministry leaders and everything like that, like you can't always have the best year in business or the best year in ministry, because sometimes they're building years, right? Sometimes they're rebuilding years where you've got to rebuild your team, rebuild your leadership team, rebuild your congregation, rebuild your focus as an organization, restructure. Like sometimes we do have to go through steps to success seasons. Not every year can be a win. I know that's been my experience over the last couple of years. We've been in struggle season for the last couple of years. Made some big life changes, big business changes, and we're just in building phase right now. And we're just slowly starting to see the results come through. But we can't always win. Dr. Rod, how would you advise someone that you're mentoring that they've, say a business leader that they've just lost team members, lost some clients, like gone through this crazy uphaul in their business? How do you shift their focus from wallowing in their sorrows and making excuses and blaming people and all that sort of stuff? How do you shift that into helping them see what the lesson is in that situation?
Well, I think we need to be clear why it is that the person is experiencing what they are experiencing. So the example you used of, say, staff, key staff leaving and so on, I would want to know whether or not this was a systematic thing. In other words, is this a feature of the business? So in the case of staff leaving, does your business or organisation have a high turnover of staff? If the answer is yes, then let's have a look at what might be causing that high turnover. And there could be a myriad of reasons, both what I would call push factors as well as pull factors.
Yeah.
So there's usually something that we're attracted to if we resign to go to another position. And often there are what I would call push factors. There are things happening in our own business or work situation that are causing us to want to move on, as long as there is another, perhaps better position to go to. So I would want to look at some of the data, such as what is the turnover of staff, to see whether or not there's something, what you might call systematic, going on here, because it may or may not point to the actual leader. There may be some deficiency in their leadership style, perhaps, that could actually be remedied through some training.
Yeah.
And I've talked to people in the past and made very simple suggestions, like consciously slow your speech down, because you speak very fast so that it sounds staccato, and people interpret that as a negative kind of personality. So there are little things that people can do to make those around them feel more comfortable.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Self-reflection, like that's really it. Like being able to, that's one thing that I do many times to a fault, is I'm over analytical of everything that I do and why it happens and everything like that. And yeah, think back to, my exit out of, I suppose, professional ministry, back into the marketplace. Now, my senior pastor at that time didn't let's just say he didn't treat me the best on the exit. It wasn't the most amicable way, or probably the best way that I would suggest a transition. However, looking back on it, once again, I know that he was going through his own pressures and his own challenges that he was facing and everything like that. And there was so many other factors involved. But I actually, looking back on it, was able to analyze, like, what happened here. And one big question that I asked myself is, what is God doing here? Now, it doesn't mean that God always causes those things to happen. I actually kind of feel like it was, in my interpretation of what that situation was, is I know God called me to give him a sabbatical out of the marketplace, give him a year volunteering in the local church. And I did that. That year that he called me to give was turned into almost 3 years, and me kind of almost forming it into a career. And I believe it was just God kind of pulling the rug out from underneath me to force me back into the marketplace, because I obviously missed the messages along the way of him going, you're not meant to be in the church, you're meant to be in the marketplace, right? And so I can see what God was doing in that situation. Now, like I said, it's not always, I interpret it now. I think we try to blame or whatever, put too much on God. Sometimes it's not. When I say I feel like it was God pulling the rug out, he may not have been. It may have just been poor leadership and that just being the situation, whatever. That's the way I like to look at it. Like, oh yeah, that's the way. And it helps me reconcile with the situation a little bit more. Now, just don't think that God is always doing something, like God is punishing me because of this, or God is like, it's not always that. However, God does not always create the situation. However, God can always use the situation, right? Now, God may not have been pulling the rug out from underneath me. However, the rug was pulled out from underneath me, and God probably went, great, this is a good moment to get you back into the marketplace, right? And so maybe just ask yourself, what is God doing through this? Or what will God be doing with this, to help you guide? Dr. Rod, What was a loss that you have faced as a leader that you found challenging to find the lesson, but you found the lesson? And how did you actually find that lesson?
Well, I have had one instance that I can recall when I was involuntarily removed from a senior position, and someone else was brought in to take it on, and I was mightily disappointed because that was my dream job. That was the job I really wanted, and I think I did a reasonably good job in the role. But look, I had the opportunity to meet the person who came into the role, and I realised after I'd had a short conversation with them, they were going to do a pretty decent job. Who knows? That they mightn't have been as good as me. I don't know. We'll never know. But I was quite certain that he was going to actually care for the people, and that was really important to me. That he would not be, as it were, spending time to try to remove the general kind of principles that I'd put in place as a leader, which placed a very high priority on ascertaining and meeting the needs of the people who worked for me. And, and in terms also of being available for people to come and chat to if they needed to, that didn't change. And so what really reconciled me was the fact that the person who'd been brought in to replace me, he did a good job. He was a good guy. He was another Christian. He was a Catholic. I was a Pentecostal. So there were clearly some differences theologically, but our understanding of the importance of human beings, the centrality of human beings in creation was exactly the same. Our moral and ethical positions on all of the key issues that were facing the organisation at the time, they were absolutely identical. So I was able to forgive because it wasn't all that hard, in the sense that I was very confident that the new leader would sort of maintain what I considered to be all of the positive initiatives that I'd taken when I came into that position. And I might add, after another person who also had similar values. So there was a procession of three people in that position, all of whom had, almost identical understandings about the centrality of human beings in the workplace. So I got over it. It took me a while, and I do recall, I may have shared it on this podcast, that months later, I'm talking about 7, 8, 9, 10 months after that had happened, I was given another job in the organisation, by the way, so I wasn't made redundant or sacked or anything like that. But it was many months afterwards. I was going to, oddly enough, to the launch of a new CD. So we're talking a few years ago, a new CD by a country music artist.
Hold on a second, Dr. Rod. I just want to explain. A CD is short for compact disc, and it's a round thing that looks like a bit of a mirror that we old people used to put music on and slide it into a computer or into our car and listen to about 6, depends if it was MP3 or in real disc format, 16 to 20 songs on it. That was back in the day when we used to carry around that, right? Just to explain what those things are.
Well, most people know what a DVD is, so a CD looks like a DVD, although they're dying out as well. But anyway, off I was. My wife and I were in the car, and we got halfway there, and I just felt the Lord nudging me, saying, "You've got to forgive the guy who effectively sacked me." And it was strange because I really thought I had.
Yeah.
But obviously God knew me better than I knew myself. So I said, sure, I'll forgive. And that was that.
So good. Forgiveness is so crucial to leadership. I mean, that we teach that in our second week of our leadership program is forgiveness. You can't go into leading other people if you're carrying unforgiveness. And that's really important. Thank you, Dr. Rod. And so remember, if you suffer loss in your business, in your ministry, in your life, it's not a failure. As Janus says, it is steps to success. So I hope you can carry that with you, and in facing your next loss, find what the lessons are in it, see what God is doing through the situation, and forgive. That's probably an important one. So people that I think are struggling to forgive are the French. So it's weird, Dr. Rod, that they have a national day of protest. It's called May Day, and it's the May Day of protest, right? That they regularly, that every year they get out and they peacefully protest whatever it is that they're upset about at the time. Now, unfortunately, right now there's been, I would call them riotous protests that have been happening since mid-January, right? And now we're almost middle of May. So what we're talking like four months this has been going on for. And it all started out because they the French are responding to their loss of retirement. They're moving the age from 62 to 64. And so this is what they're protesting. They're protesting the fact that they're moving the age and they're losing 2 years of their retirement. But they're actually not really protesting that. Yeah, they are. They're upset that they have to work another 2 years or anything. So, I know you see this and you go, if you think about all the time, like an extra 2 years, whatever, like, and in Australia, it's 65 anyway. Like it's like, oh, 62, you're already like 3 years ahead of us anyway. But what they're really protesting about is really their loss of freedom, or sorry, their loss of diplomacy. That's probably the right word for it. Their loss of diplomacy, because President Macron, I don't know if I'm saying that right, but I have to say it that way. Otherwise, every time I read it, Dr. Rod, for some reason, I say macaroon in my head.
You wouldn't be the first.
um,
And some have done it deliberately.
Yeah, President Macron, without the majority in the parliament, actually deployed a mechanism called Article 49.3, which means he can actually bypass the parliament and go straight to let me get these levels of right. Did I write it down? No. So the Senate or whatever the higher people to be able to vote on it, where he knows that he has a majority. Now, this Article 49.3 is a thing where the leader or the president is allowed to bypass parliament for something that is like high importance, and if they feel like this is truly, it has to just be rushed through and go past the being held back in the parliament. So there's a constitutional council deciding whether he's actually allowed to do that. But that's what the protests are really about, is like the fact that he's just kind of just taking control and just gone, well, I'm just going to do what I want. Now, sometimes we as leaders have to make tough decisions. Sometimes we just have to make decisions without asking people's opinions, because we know what's right, we know what's best, and there's sometimes we just have to make those hard decisions. And it seems like, from what he's talking about, is that, like, his argument is that if this doesn't get passed, because there's an increase in life expectancy, people are living for longer, our retirement fund is going to go bankrupt because we won't be able to sustain paying for people for so long. So we're just increasing it by 2 years to make sure that we can actually still afford, and not the country doesn't collapse. Obviously, as an economist, you can share that a little bit more, but actually, yeah, let's do that. Dr. Rod, let's talk practically about that situation first, and then we'll get into the leadership stuff. What's your take on, like, the seriousness of the situation and how much does it really affect the economy and like that sort of stuff?
Well, it will certainly affect some people in the economy. France, along with a lot of other European countries, has very generous social security provisions overall. And certainly people in the United States, where I am at the moment, they would envy what happens in most of the European countries in terms of social welfare of one kind or another. And I think one of the issues that has led to the riotous behaviour of people in France is that the status quo is being interrupted. And you're quite right to say that in Australia and other countries, that age limit on receiving a government pension has been increased. Mm. So in Australia, for me, given my year of birth, I have to be 66 and a half years old before I become eligible to any pension payment. For my wife, who's a little younger than I am, she'll have to be 67. And that's when they will stop increasing the age when it reaches that age of 67. So it will be fully 5 years longer to wait than for the French prior to the introduction of this change. But you see, you've actually got to look at any change in the whole context of the country and comparing their age of entitlement to a government pension with ours in Australia or with what is standard in New Zealand or the United Kingdom or other countries really doesn't tell the whole story. You've really got to look at the overall situation of government benefits to people. Of course, from the president's point of view, the big issue is actually paying for the pension amounts.
So is that actually, like from an economist point of view, is that such a serious thing that he has to now risk that the whole country has been in turmoil and has pretty much been shut down, since middle of January? Is that such a risk to the future of the country's economy?
Well, it may be in the long term. At the moment, France devotes something like 14% of their gross domestic product, if you like. That's the size of the national economic pizza, from which we all derive our living standard and so on. They spend about 14% of that on pensions, which is actually quite high by international standards. And of course, what's happening not only is the population aging, but the proportion of people who are actually paying taxes is falling.
These people having less children.
The size of the working, that's right, the size of the working age population is falling away as well.
And everyone's becoming influencers.
There's a
no one's actually doing real work anymore.
For the budget and for the economy as people get older and they reach for their entitlements, but there are fewer and fewer people as a proportion of the population who are actually making enough income to pay taxes. So there is also that whole issue of intergenerational equity going on here.
Yeah.
But the French have tended to be a bit more likely to protest than the citizens in many other countries. And demonstrations by farmers, for example, have been quite regular occurrences in France for many decades now. Look, once a government gives people something, people are extremely reluctant to give it up. So I'm not all that surprised that there have been as many protests as have been recorded in terms of the changes to pension. And sometimes saying, well, look over there in a different country, they've got a different age, doesn't really satisfy people because their reaction is really based on the experience that they've had in their own country. And frankly, they couldn't care less what happens somewhere else. Yep. I do think, however, that we just need to be really careful that we don't end up making an idol of the government pension. I hear so many Christians who can't wait to get on the pension. I think, what is wrong with you? I mean, I want to stay off the pension as long as I can.
Yeah.
I want to be able to work
Yeah.
to earn a decent salary.
Yeah.
I'd rather never to rely on the
Uh-huh.
government. I just don't understand why it
Yeah.
is that Christians seem to think it's a good idea to rely on governments
And
to
I don't want to
subsidise
stop
them at
working
any
either.
age.
I
No,
love
no.
what I do. I
I would say
minimize
it's
some
nice that
things,
it's
but
there, though.
mm,
It's good that it's there. But look, as Christians, our whole mindset should be on work, doing productive work that's meaningful work, that's just helping somebody else thrive.
yeah.
It's not necessarily paid employment. As
Mm,
you know, much of the work I do nowadays doesn't produce any income at all.
yeah.
I sit on boards. People are not paying me for that. I chair a board. I'm not paid for that. I've been asked to join more boards, as a matter of fact. None of them are offering payment. It's wonderful that I can work and not receive a salary.
Yeah.
But we should all remain active. We will live a longer life, and I dare say it'll be a much happier life. So look, these things are quite complex. Every nation really has faced this issue of an aging population on average, which means there's a smaller proportion of the population carrying on the tax burden, so to speak. It is offset to some extent, of course, by the fact that some people actually do work much later than they otherwise might. And I would add, a lot of people enjoy it because work is more, as it were, than just the work. It's about social relationships and place in society and so on as well. And all of those things can be very important to people in terms of their own self-image.
Yeah. So there's I kind of feel like there's two different stories here for leaders, right? And to go on the kind of the theme of today about how we deal with loss, how leaders deal with loss, obviously it's the protesters that are dealing with loss of their retirement that are going out and protesting. Now, I have like in my brief research and looking around, they did say that obviously there's all these violent, clashes between, the police and protesters and setting things on fire and breaking into places and all that sort of stuff. Like there is that happening. However, a lot of the reports that I said it's only really on the fringes, and the majority of the protest is actually peaceful. So that's reassuring because all you're seeing from it is like France is rioting and it's tearing itself apart, right? They're obviously not dealing with the loss well because they're rioting. However, what's I kind of this actually kind of goes back to our first thing, that my first bit of a rant that I spoke about is like, how do we know to how's the best way to challenge authority, right? That most of us are in a leadership, maybe in a leadership position, but most of us are actually under someone else. And if not, we're under a government, we're under the police, and so how do we let's take out the fact that maybe he's doing this right or he can do this or the president or whatever. Like, let's take that out of it. But people feel like their powers, their democratic powers, that's kind of like the main thing. Let's even leave the retirement thing aside. They believe that the president's kind of just, you know, um, kind of abusing his power, so to speak, right? And they want to fight against that, stand up against that. Like how do we righteously fight for our rights? What's the difference between a protest and a riot? Obviously, I know violence and all that, but like, how do we reconcile that?
Well, look, firstly, as Christians, we should recognise that our sustenance comes from God, not the government.
Hmm.
And one of the wonderful blessings that we have of being Christians is that we can rely on God to supply all that we have need of. Sometimes, of course, we've got to work our faith muscle. It's not easy come,
Yeah,
but
look, I agree with that. And let me just, hate to use the word, but let me play devil's advocate for a moment, because I know lots of people that there is one side of the camp that they do that. They're like, put our complete faith in God, and then they ignore what's happening, and then politics, they don't vote right, they don't like, do you know what I mean? Like there's, and then all of a sudden they find themselves in a world of like, well, this is not what I wanted. It's like, well, did you do anything about it? Or did you just go, God, my provider, right? And like, how, what's your response to those people?
Well, don't be silly.
Yeah.
Dear, God's my provider, but look around for opportunities. Ask God to show you doors that you might be able to go through in terms of generating some income. Sometimes, by the way, you've accumulated an awful lot of stuff, and you can sell that and make a lot of money. When I say a lot of money, quite a few $1,000s. So every now and then we should take stock of what we have to see whether there's some that we're not really using anymore. And if you're a bit short of cash, sell it. Now, you can't do that forever, of course. That's only something which you can do in the short term. But look, always before you rush into protest, just check yourself and say, look, do I really believe that God is my provider? Second, when what we are dealing with is something you don't agree with that's happened through political decision making, don't forget that you've always got the ballot box, at least in democracies we have.
Yeah.
That isn't the case everywhere, but we shouldn't use our democratic rights without great care and judgment. So, I talk to a lot of Christians who disconnect spirituality from the ballot box, yet we really must include the spiritual side of things in our decision about for whom we vote. I think that's absolutely critical. So for my own part, without sort of naming any parties, there are some political parties who have rules that bind their parliamentarians and so on, which would make it extremely hard for me to vote for them because I'm philosophically opposed to that approach, fundamentally because in a true democracy, your local representative should be looking after locals and paying attention to local issues. But I guess we're getting off the topic a little bit here. Is there a role for say peaceful demonstrations publicly? Yes, there is. There's no doubt about that. And in a country like Australia, there are rallies, protests in most of the major areas of population against certain moral occurrences or certain government legislation or government practices that go against the moral thinking of Christians. I think that's part of what we're meant to do as Christians, actually. We're meant to be in the public square, and we are meant to make our beliefs, our values, our position on key policy areas. We're meant to make them public. I think we are meant to have a presence in the public square. So yes, there is a place for protesting, and I think it should always be a peaceful protest. Are there any circumstances under which things might go so far that we should take up arms against government? Well, I believe that to be true. I don't believe that to be true in the case of the French president about whom we've been speaking, because I don't think the issue at hand is of the kind of nature that would warrant a significant uprising by the population.
So you don't feel like going on to the other leadership lesson we're talking about with this is sometimes leaders just have to make the hard decisions and bypass the normal channels of communication to just maybe the country might be going bankrupt if this doesn't happen, and it's just one of, and he's probably doing a bunch of other things as well, but this is what they're jumping on. How do we as leaders make sure we approach that decision? Because obviously communication is important, keeping everyone following the right channels of process and everything like that is really good, because if you do away with that, the whole system falls apart. Like I agree with that. However, how do we as leaders make these tough decisions that sometimes we just know that something has to be done and avoid an uprising like this?
Well, that's a difficult one because when you're talking about an uprising, it's not something which is really led by one person. My understanding is that these particular protests and riots were certainly originally they were quite organic. They just happened. A bit like the fires of revival that have been reported right around the world at the moment. They just happen. In one case, they're a sovereign move of God. In another case, I guess you could say they're a sovereign move of man.
Yeah.
I don't think they're all that edifying. But as leaders, we should encourage people to hear from God, and we should do the same ourselves. Now, most people in leadership positions are probably not going to be engaged a lot in public protests. I don't know what it's like in many other countries,
No, but let's take it from this point of view. We all know the story. You're a pastor of a church. Just imagine you're a pastor of a church, and you need to make a decision to move location, move service time, do something, appoint a new leader, remove a leader from a position, whatever. And you know that this is just, it needs to bypass the normal modes of putting it out to the church for a vote, and not like this. It just is one of those things that just needs to happen. And that there's always unfortunately a select group of people in the church that are ready to pounce and protest against anything, and rally everyone and create a bit of a revolt, and maybe try to create a faction in the church. We've all seen it, right? How do we as a leader make that tough decision, knowing that there's the volatility of something like that happening?
Look, if I'm understanding you correctly, you're talking about whether or not, as a leader, I should participate in what we might call a church split.
No,
Is that
what
what
I'm
you're
saying
asking for?
is making the actual decision that the president did, of bypassing the normal,
Oh, I see. Yes, yes,
approval
yes, yes.
processes and everything like that, is making that decision that is just a tough decision that that just needs to be made.
Well, the first thing you've got to make sure is that you've got the constitutional power to do that. And my understanding is Macron did that. But a church leader always has to be bound by the rules, the norms that are bound up, say, in the constitutional documents of the organisation. So, in some denominations, there's quite strict law. We call that canon law, actually, which will dictate the sort of processes involved. And I think you need to follow those. The case we were looking at, in the case of President Macron, there was a power he could invoke. Now, it was contestable, that power, which I understand it has been contested by a constitutional court, and the constitutional court has found certainly that in a technical sense he had the authority to bypass the normal channels. So you need to make sure that that's actually something which your founding documents allow before you do it. Otherwise, I don't think you've got much option but either to grin and bear it or to resign. I think it's very dangerous to overrule a constitutional document.
So that's good. So obviously make sure we've got the rights to do it. Like that, that's great. Make sure we're following policy. Good. You and I both know that a lot of people don't care about policy and they care more about their feelings. And so how do we avoid those people? Like, how do you approach that? You have to make this decision. You've checked your constitution. You have the policies are in, right. You're above board with everything, but there's going to be a revolt about it. How do we approach that situation?
Well, you've really got to determine in your heart whether it's the right decision to make.
Mm,
And if you say, well, okay, I realise that there will be protests, there will be those who criticise me, there are those who might try to pull me down, remove me. If it's the right decision, you need to make the right decision using the right process and the right channels. I
yeah.
have been in that kind of situation before, and it was uncomfortable. A group of people came and said they thought I should remove myself. I said no, because I'd heard from the Lord that it wasn't time to make the change. But interestingly, a few months down the track, I heard unmistakably from the Lord that it was time to step down from that leadership position, and I let people know. And by that time, they were in fact really sorry to see me go. Um, Something I guess had changed. They had a different perception, perhaps. So you've got to really look into the specific context. I think
Yeah.
what's led up to the situation. What are the potential ways forward? And is it essential that that happen under a new leader? I guess if the answer to that is yes, then if you're that leader, you really need to go before somebody shoves you. But it's not that easy to draw all these lessons from the Macron
Yeah.
example, because it sits within the context of a particular a national constitutional framework, and it appears that he's got the constitutional power to do what he did.
Yeah.
So I don't see much of a problem with it. And of course, his background is in business, and he's looking ahead into the future and drawing the conclusion that we're going to have a lot of trouble funding other things if we tie so much of our annual income as a nation, if we tie so much of that up in paying pensions into the
Yeah.
future, bearing in mind that it will grow. Um, so I don't know whether, as leaders in other contexts, we're necessarily in exactly the same sort of situation. Um, Probably the most common thing that might happen would be that if you happen to be, say, a director, you need to become a bit more engaged in management
Yeah.
activities. You and I have actually talked about this in recent times ourselves, that sometimes just for a season it's necessary for those in a governance position to take on more of a management role, but that should only be for a season as well, and that might produce a bit of protest.
Yeah.
Um, but I think we just got to look at the particular context. I'm thinking about some correspondence I received just this week about a protest march that was held in Brisbane against abortion.
Mm,
And those protests are generally extremely well organised. Everybody's pleasant, everyone's courteous, and they're planned. All the permissions have been received from the police and so on and so forth. So they're meticulously planned, and that I would see as Christians exercising their right effectively to have a say in the public square. So I think that kind of thing is fairly regular, and it's a good thing actually. It's part of our participation as citizens of a free country, of a democratic country. But it's much more difficult when we start talking about specific situations within a particular organisation. It's a
yeah.
little bit different when the people who are protesting, the people on our own payroll.
Yes.
The power dynamics are different, and so on.
Yeah. So if you feel like you're losing your powers or your rights or whatever, or your democratic freedom, and feel like you need to protest, make sure you protest with it peacefully, right? Follow the right channels, follow the right communication. Like have sit down with people, have a chat, like gather people, like try to do it with wisdom and not get emotional over it. I think that that's probably the real separation between there's people that are you can be passionate about something without getting emotional, because when emotions come in, that's where things tend to break down. So make sure if you feel like you're called to protest something, do it with wisdom, do it with peace, taking that calm, like Dr. Rod said, there's a peaceful process that happen, and it's fine. Do follow due process, and yes, fight for your rights, but just remember, when we're fighting for our rights, we are still representing the king. And so we want to still bring kingdom through the way that we protest as well. And then also, if you feel like you have to make that tough decision as a leader, sometimes we do have to bypass majority votes and things like that. Just make sure that you're following your protocols, make sure you are within your governance requirements to do so, and make sure that you are right in what you do. That right word, right comes from righteous. You're being right in what you're doing. Make sure that is done well. Speaking about things being done well, Dr. Rod, rockets blowing up. Now, I don't know. Did you watch the SpaceX rocket launch at all, Dr. Rod?
I didn't watch it, but I've read a lot about it over the last couple of months, that's for sure.
And obviously, with your son-in-law being in the aerospace, I'm sure, and being an engineer himself, there's probably some pretty cool communications that are going on about this. What? Yes, it was a couple of weeks ago, but it was something that I really wanted to talk about, and it took us a while to. There were some other more important things that jumped into play, but it fit perfectly in this. How do we, as leaders, reconcile loss? How do we handle loss? Well, SpaceX seems to handle loss of multi-million dollar things good. So let's take a lesson from them, because they just on April 20, rocket ship, which was like the most powerful rocket ever built, called the Starship, exploded, and their explanation for it was a rapid, unscheduled disassembly. I love that. It blew up. No, it didn't blow up. It was a rapid, unscheduled disassembly. And they were quoted as saying it was a very successful failure. Why? Because what they actually said is their aim for this test, it was the first time that these two components had actually been put together. And this is the test was purely to see if they would launch. They just wanted to get off the launch pad. That's kind of all that they wanted to achieve. Now, they stayed in the air for like over 3 minutes, and then some jets didn't fire and things didn't uncouple, and so it started spiraling. And so they pressed the rapid unscheduled disassembly button to blow it up, so it obviously didn't hurt anyone and everything like that. And they were saying that, look, it exceeded our expectations. All what we wanted to do was get off the launch pad, and we got way beyond that. And so it's exciting. And was it a failure? Was it a loss? No. They say it was a success. Why? Because they set expectations. They set realistic expectations. I feel like that's the key. Disappointment is just unmet expectations. Who has control of expectations? We have control of our expectations. And I know I'm preaching to myself. I'm the worst one with this. Probably my most common conversation with Dr. Rod and my psychologist are my expectations. I have a lot of expectations. And it's how we manage our expectations is how I believe is one key way of how we manage loss. So, Dr. Rod, how do we, because it doesn't seem like setting your expectations for a launch of a multi-million, like probably hundreds of millions of dollars of rocket, setting your expectation of like, we just wanted to get off the launch pad. It doesn't seem like you think you'd be setting yourself up, like doing a test like that and wanting a little bit more than just getting off a launch pad. It doesn't seem like a leader would be driving their team to just get off the launch pad. But like, it seems like their culture and what was actually quoted is they like to fail fast. It takes NASA 10 years in the report. It took them 10 years to build something to get to launch, and these people are like building it in a couple of days and then explode. Not a couple of days, but obviously. But how do we as leaders still try to drive towards an outcome? Let's call it results, but set that expectation to be so minimal?
Well, it's quite interesting that this came after the so-called failure of the rocket launch. I'm sure their publicity machine wasn't saying this is all we hope to achieve before the launch. So look, the philosophy of failing fast is quite a good one. Fail fast and early so you learn a lot of lessons before learning those lessons becomes so expensive it could actually cause the whole project to fail. Look, it would be silly not to take the opportunity that a failure, so-called failure such as that occurring, you'd be silly not to learn from it because of the multi-million-dollar expense in getting it off the ground in the first place. So I remember John Maxwell, leadership author and speaker, wrote a book called Failing Forward, Falling Forward.
Falling Forward, yes.
No, Falling Forward. Because normally we fall backwards, right? So this was a bit of a play on words, but it was really focused on what we might learn as leaders from the mistakes that we make.
Yeah.
And, it's unlikely that SpaceX anticipated the thing would fail. Otherwise, they wouldn't have launched it in the first place. But obviously, there are great risks involved with a brand new technology like that. As you mentioned, some of the engines failed on the first stage of the rocket, and the decoupling didn't take place as it was designed to do. So it sounds to me like there may have been some communication issues with the separation of the two stages of the rocket. And that could be human error, actually, in the writing of the code, which is very, very complex. So you want to learn about that because eventually these spacecraft are going to be carrying human beings into space. So you want to fix it if you can, and the sooner you fix it, the better. The failure
I was thinking about that. The rapid unscheduled disassembly button that they have there. It would be much more difficult to press that button if there was someone on there, wouldn't there? Like that would make it a very difficult conversation.
That would be a very substantial ethical issue to consider. But I doubt that you had more than a split second to consider it. Or at the most a couple of minutes. There wouldn't have been much time. But I do think it's a good philosophy, as it were, to fail fast without failing foolishly.
Yes.
Because obviously a lot of money has been invested in this particular launch, and you don't want to waste money, and worse, you don't want to throw good money after bad. So once a so-called failure has occurred, you should do everything you possibly can to learn from it. And that has actually been the hallmark of space, or actually of explanation of not only space, but the air in general. If you go back to the early days of flying machines, there were lots of failures there as well, but lessons were learned. And one of the most famous, of course, would have been the Comet 1 jet aircraft. It was the first commercial jet aircraft that entered into operation. So it was a competitor for the Boeing 707, the DC-8, and the Convair 550, I think it was, or 880. Doesn't really matter. But the trouble is it crashed. Now, they actually ended up discovering that the crashes resulted from depressurization of the cabins, and it was actually due to the design of the windows, because they just carried over the design of windows from propeller-driven aircraft that weren't flying as high or as fast. And that was why they changed to using much rounder windows because they can withstand much higher pressures. So you live and learn. Preferably, you do that before human lives are lost. So there have been many quite spectacular examples in space exploration. Remember that there was that one launch that went quite badly wrong, and human lives were actually sacrificed in that one. But a lot of lessons were learned. I think the important thing is we don't waste failures.
Yeah.
That we actually use failures as an opportunity to learn, so that we don't make the same mistakes in the future.
Let's jump back to expectations, because I kind of feel like that's the key takeaway that I got from it. Obviously, the failing and the lessons and stuff like that is crucial. But what really stood out to me is them saying, well, our expectations were, and actually they did actually say it during like the actual launch, as they were, the coverage of it, they were saying, all we want to do is get off the launch pad. And then they kept saying all the way through it, beyond what we expected. Oh, this is awesome. Everything from here on is a bonus. So unfortunately, we had to say goodbye to Dr. Rod. So it's just myself. And we're just going to be getting into the last segment, which is leadership lessons from Luke. Looking at how we can become better leaders from what it says in the Bible, and usually in line, this week in line with our topic of the week, which we're talking about how leaders handle loss. How do we deal with loss? Because as leaders, we face loss all the time, but how do we deal with it? Well, why not jump straight to the parable of loss here in Luke 15:1, the lost sheep. Suppose one of you has 100 sheep and loses one of them. Does he not leave the 99 in the open country and go after the lost sheep until he finds it? And when he finds it, he joyfully puts it on his shoulders and goes home. Then he calls his friends and neighbors together and says, "Rejoice with me, I've found my lost sheep." I tell you that in the same way, there will be more rejoicing in heaven over one sinner who repents more than over 99 righteous persons who do not need to repent. Now, I actually have a bit of a problem with this passage. The reason why I wanted to talk about this is it's not really talking about loss as a leader, but I thought we could draw a comparison from it and maybe a contrast from it. Because I view everything through the lens of leadership. That's just the way my brain is wired. I read everything and I see this of Jesus talking about that he loses one of his sheep and then leaves the rest of his sheep in an open field and goes looking for the one. And I don't know, that grinds my gears. It just gets me like, I'm like, that's not quite good leadership, is it? Like, if you were leading a business and one of your clients left you, would you neglect 99 of your clients who needed your attention to go chasing after that one you lost? Probably not. That's why I kind of wanted to talk about this is just understand that there's not always a direct comparison, because this here is talking about salvation. This here is talking about how important the lost are. Now, remember, there's a couple of things to look here. Now, actually, one thing we're talking about the Bible, but I want to bring out another book, because I read this story to my son most nights, and it's the missing sheep. So it's the Bible story and the missing sheep. And when we always get to this point where he left the 99 sheep behind on the hillside, he sets off to find the lost sheep where it could be found, right? Now, I like this illustration because I add a little bit of extra information to my son and I say, so what he does is he gathers all of his sheep together, makes sure that they're safe, makes sure that they're looked after, and then goes and looks for the lost sheep, which I kind of think is the good leadership lesson in this is God doesn't actually say, or Jesus doesn't actually say here that he's leaving them. Because if you look at what he's actually referring to, he's talking about repentance and a sinner who repents and becomes righteous. He's comparing one sinner to 99 righteous people who don't need to repent. Now, those 99 don't actually really need Jesus. And that's why this kind of comparison with sheep is kind of lost, because I kind of feel like this lesson should have been, he says he leaves them in an open field. Now, I wonder if maybe that meant being in an open field, that meant they were safe because nothing would attack them in an open field. Or maybe he leaves them in an open field and there's other shepherds there that are also looking after them in the open fields. So I just wonder whether that context is missing from there. But the leadership lesson I feel we need to learn about dealing with loss is, yes, sometimes we're going to lose a staff member. Yes, sometimes we're going to lose a client. But that doesn't mean we neglect everything else to go chase after the one, right? That's not wisdom. We gather them together, make sure that they're all safe, make sure that they're all protected, make sure that your team are looking after your existing clients, make sure your manager is looking after your team, whatever it needs to be. Make sure everything is okay at home first. In make sure the 99 are looked after, and then yes, why not then go chase after that one and go search for that one? Because we as leaders should see each one client, each one of our staff members, each one of our dollars, whatever it is we're losing, we should see each one of them as really, really valuable. And so if we've lost something, we should go chasing after that person to make sure that we can correct that situation. Now, it doesn't always mean that team member will rejoin. It doesn't mean that client will always come back and be a client. But we need to make sure that we search them out to make sure that we don't just leave them behind. We don't leave people behind. Unfortunately, I hear this rhetoric too much in church, too much in business. I hear leaders saying all the time, well, if they're not with us, they can just get off the bus and they can be left behind. I hear people talking about, there are a trail of people behind us, or people that they're people that just couldn't keep up, or yeah, look, there's people that just weren't on the team. So if they weren't on the team, we kicked them off and we kept going. And leaders like that just leave a trail of bodies behind them. That's not the way that God's called us to lead. He talks about it in here. He says, leave the 99 and go after the one. Now, make sure the 99 are looked after. In here, the 99 don't need to repent. They're righteous, so they're looked after. They're fine. Go and look after that one. Now, does that mean you need to stop your vision, stop your calling, stop your progress just to appease everyone? No, I'm not saying that. But we can't take the attitude of just burning people and leaving them behind us. What we need to do is, just like Jesus, if one of your team members, if one of your clients, if one of your congregation leaves, you should seek them out and see that you can set it right. Now, it doesn't mean you draw them back in. There may just be a differing of opinions. That's fine. They may be better suited in another ministry, in another business. Their purpose may be better fulfilled somewhere else, and that's fine. But don't just burn them and leave them lost, right? I know the reason why we started On Purpose Cubed, our free leadership development program, is purely because I was sick of hearing all of these stories about people being burnt by leaders, both in the church and in the marketplace. And in the church, now out of relationship with Christ, now not attending church, now just lost. And people in business, them just not fulfilling their purpose, them feeling like they're being used and abused, them now doing a subpar job, not what God has actually called them to, because they were just left lost. Don't leave the people lost. If you lose something, go and make it right. Doesn't mean you regain it, but we can regain their faith. We can regain their relationship. We can at least regain face and hopefully give these people hope and give these people direction and keep, at least these people won't be lost, whether it be, physically or metaphorically or eternally. We don't want to leave them lost. So my challenge to you is, as a leader, if you lose something, chase after it, but make sure everything is taken care of first. The 99, and make sure that they're right, they're righteous. Make sure that they're right first before you go chasing after that one. Don't leave a trail of lost ones behind you. Hey, if all this stuff has been helpful at all, I appreciate you watching this through. We really appreciate you being a part of this. As we said in the first segment of today about comments, hey, throw some positive comments in here too, and share with us what you have been challenged with your leadership, you personally. Remember, we're turning this all back on ourselves to see how we can become better leaders. But if you've liked this, give it a thumbs up. And look, we would be humbly grateful if you would consider subscribing to our channel as well. Have a great week, and we'll see you next week.